Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, and a special shout out to Scottish Government USA, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Aminatta Forna to discuss The Window Seat, Notes from a Life in Motion, published by our friends at Grove Press. Aminatta Forna is the author of the novels Ancestor Stones, The Memory of Love, The Hired Man, and Happiness, as well as the memoir The Devil That Danced on the Water. Aminatta's books have been translated into 22 languages. Her essays have appeared in Brick, Freeman's, Granta, The Guardian, Literary Hub, the New York Review of Books Daily, The Observer, and Vogue. She is currently Director and Lannan Foundation Chair of Poetics at the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice at Georgetown University. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by John Freeman. John is the founder of the literary annual Freeman's and the author and editor of 10 books, including Dictionary of the Undoing, The Park, Tales of Two Planets, The Penguin Book of the Modern American Short Story, and with Tracy K. Smith, There's a Revolution Outside My Love. The former editor of Granta, he lives in New York City, where he teaches writing at NYU and is an executive editor at Alfred A. Knopf. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Window Seat from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome, Aminatta.
Thank you.
Welcome, John.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Forna. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Such a pleasure to be talking to my good friend Aminatta Forna about her new book, The Window Seat. How are you doing, Aminatta?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. It's muggy here. I'm going to jump right in. You were talking to me the other day, and you said something so perceptive about what an essay is versus what a memoir is. And you said that an essay is something where the drama evolves from making transparent the evolution of your thought as an author. You know, basically that you're letting the reader in on your thinking process. And I guess my first question to you about The Window Seat, which is a series of essays you wrote over the last 10 to 12 years, which ranges in place and time from Sierra Leone to Scotland to Iran, where you lived as an early teenager, to the journeys made by Obama Senior's, Barack Obama's father, and your own father, from countries within Africa to places within England and the United States for education. What is it that you were thinking through, do you think, in these essays?
Well, thank you for that, and hello, everybody. And thank you, Book and Books. Gosh, that's a quite a tall order. What was I thinking through with each essay? I think what I was trying to understand was the gap between how I understood the world and what other people thought the world was. I don't mean everybody, but I mean some people, typically the people who were sent to interview me over many years of being a writer, but also before that when I was a journalist. And, I grew up in the world. I was born in one place and brought up in several other places, and chose to live in, London, and then moved to America, and all the places that you have mentioned. And I guess and also my father did that too, and my mother did that too. So, you know, there was nothing in my world, right? There was nothing particularly extraordinary about doing that. And yet it was always treated as extraordinary and treated as unusual. And sometimes people would say, well, you're very confusing. And I was sort of struggled to understand why, because it seemed to me that there was a lost narrative in the world, and the narrative was one of movement. And so in the book, I write about all the people in my family and, you know, going way back hundreds and hundreds of years who have moved. You know, the Malians who moved to Sierra Leone, the Vikings who moved to the Shetlands and to Scotland, you know, my grandmother who moved to Canada, my grandfather who travelled widely, and all the other Scots who moved to Australia and to Canada and to other places. I mean, it has been part and parcel of our human existence since the first people walked out of Africa. So yet we now find ourselves in a time when suddenly location and place and staking your identity within a location has somehow become extremely, I wouldn't say important, but it's kind of risen to the surface. You know, it's become something everybody wants to talk about. Are you muted? Because you're very quiet.
There's a passage in Haim, the essay, about your trip back to the Shetlands, in which you write, there are those who leave and those who stay, and there are those who come and go for some other reason, privilege, position, marriage, work, escape. And it seems like one of the brilliant things about this series of essays is that you're showing how those things, those reasons for movement connect and overlap and pull apart within individual families even, such as your own. And I guess one of the things that was surprising for me, because I read your previous memoir, The Devil That Danced on Water, and as you write in that book, you write much more about your family life in Sierra Leone, because it's the story of growing up there and then leaving because your father was arrested for political reasons and then killed for political reasons, and you go back as an adult to try to find out what happened to him, in a nutshell, for those who haven't read it. And for that reason, the Scottish side of your upbringing does not play as big a part in that memoir as it does here. And I was surprised when you're in reading Haim that your family, your Scottish family, were all migrants. They were always traveling every which way in every direction. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why and what that meant for you upon discovering it.
Well, I didn't write about my Scottish family early on, just simply because Sierra Leone had a war and it required an answer, you know, and that required investigation. But my Scottish family, I knew some of the stories pretty well. And then, of course, since it's been a journey I've been on for quite a while, I've discovered more stories, and my mother has discovered more stories. But essentially, the Scots are a highly migratory nation, highly migratory, and some of that has been forced by the clearances. And in the case of my own family, people moved for reasons of work, principally, but also something called assisted migration, which was the British Empire's attempt to expand itself. And so the government would actually pay people, of course, certain kinds of people, poorer people, less fortunate people, or, people whose land they might want, but paid them to go and settle other places. So in Haim, which is, of course, the Shetlandic or Scots home, one of the things I write about is my grandmother, who went to live in Canada, in Toronto, and actually was not a successful migrant not in the sense that she couldn't look after herself. She had family there. her brothers had already gone, and an aunt had already gone. But she was deeply, deeply unhappy in Canada. And so she took the first boat back she could. So under assisted migration, you had to stay for 2 years, right? You had to give it 2 years. Otherwise, you had to pay your own fare home. And one of the things we discovered when we were looking at her story was the day after 2 years was up, she hopped back on a boat and went back to Scotland and never left again. But even before that, my Scottish family, my grandfather's side came from the furthest town on the most northerly island of the Shetlands. I mean, you couldn't get further away from the British Isles. I mean, being the sea, the only place beyond that was the sea, the most northerly place. And everyone is so crazy about DNA now. My mother had done her DNA, and I wasn't too wild. I guess I was as curious as anybody else, but I felt like I knew the stories, so I didn't feel like there was going to be any great revelation. But it was interesting to see in that, that 50% of my blood is West African, 50% of my blood is Scots, with a little bit of Icelandic and a little chunk of Norse. And so the people on the Shetland Islands actually are all descended from, well, I forget what the figure is now, but it's something like 70% carry Viking blood. So, but the other interesting thing about the Shetlands was that the migration went both ways. So there were the Vikings who landed and some settled and they lived there and ruled it for many hundreds of years. But also the other interesting thing I found out was with the clearances, there are people who leave the mainland and go to the Orkneys and Shetlands to settle. So yeah, the movement has been constant. I mean, there's even there was a Christensen, which is my grandfather's name, had a sheep station in Australia. There was another one that took the Japanese surrender. They were busy folk all over the world. So I guess the thing about the whole, when you say you're surprised, because you didn't know my Scottish side because I hadn't written about it, but I am constantly surprised at the surprise, because you and I are now in a country which is made of migrants, right? Completely composed of migrants. And yet there does seem to be this constant conversation around movement as though it's something that only just began, as though it's something new.
Well, I think, as you write in other essays, such as Power Walking, which is a meditation about sort of occupying space on the street in 3 different locations as a Black woman in West Africa, in London, and then in America, that certain movement is more tolerable to the way the world is organized in power, to those in power. So certain migrations are fine and considered welcome, while others are less so. Some migration is presented as heroic, where others is seen as grabby or sort of even underhanded. And one of the things I love about your book is that you look at migration from so many different angles that it begins to become the norm, and that you sort of sand down that weighting system of some migrations being more worthy than others. And I would love you to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, it depends who's looking, doesn't it? So the gaze, it depends to whom does the gaze belong. When the gaze belongs to Europeans, they always saw movement, the exploration. The third, or I forget, is it the third or fourth son? The first one inherits, the second one goes into the army, third one becomes a cleric, fourth one travels in the English aristocracy. So, there was the idea of exploration, the idea of conquest, and I guess if you're not doing any of those things through the lens of the European gaze, your migration is not a noble one. On the other hand, if you're in any of those countries where those conquerors are arriving, their migration may seem less than noble. And I think that's actually the moment that we're in right now, with the statues being pulled down, is, whose gaze is this? Columbus doesn't look so great if you were a Native American. He might look great if you're a Spaniard, but he doesn't look... Was he Portuguese or Spanish?
He was funded by the Portuguese, but he was...
There's actually some doubt about where he came. Anyway, if you came from, if you came from that part of Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, you probably think, and if you are a settler American, you probably think of Columbus in one way, and if you're a Native American, you think of Columbus in a different way. So it's really all about to whom does the gaze, who holds the gaze, and whose gaze are we looking through. And so I think that for those of us who have spent a lifetime moving, we now get into that moment of the sort of double consciousness where I am aware of how I'm seen. On the other hand, I don't see my movement in that way. I move because that's the way the world currents have taken me, right? And so my movement when I was younger, before it became my choice, my movement was because Britain was the ruling power in Sierra Leone, because my father met my mother, because my mother married a diplomat after her divorce from my father. She married a diplomat, so we went to move with him. And then later on I moved for university, and then later on again I moved for work. I could equally and easily have moved for marriage or something else, but we all move for different reasons, and people move all the time.
This book is continuously reversing the gaze that you just described, such to the point that you describe your father and mother celebrating the independence of Sierra Leone in Aberdeen in the mid-1960s, having a party there. And when you map colonial history that way, it becomes both about geography and people, and people being transported into the sort of so-called heart of the empire from the outside of the empire. And I feel like your travel log, as it were, because I think this book is a kind of travel book as well, does that kind of scrambling of the gaze throughout, that you're watching history as a participant and an observer in many places. And I guess I'm curious how it felt to come home to Scotland, given how many different places you had lived in and been part of colonial history, to then be back in Scotland, in the last 15 years. Did you look at your family history any differently than maybe you would have growing up?
I did, actually, because my relationship with Scotland, we did live there when I was a kid, but my relationship with Scotland was through my mother and then through my grandparents. But my mother was this highly itinerant soul who'd spent most of her life outside Scotland, and although she is an enthusiast of her culture, and she holds on to large parts of it and is very proud of it, she didn't really represent Scotland to me. The people who represented Scotland to me were my grandparents. And my grandparents looked after me a lot when I was a kid, and I spent a lot of time in their home, and they told me their stories. Well, they told me the stories of, the sort of stories you tell kids, but Scottish fairy stories. So that was really my connection to Scotland, was through them. But the world that I saw that they inhabited, which I now realize was not exactly accurate, because I was a kid, it was their little house in Aberdeen. It was the park we went to. It was, the statue of Rob Roy. It was all of that. was deeside. My grandfather sent me a haggis every Burns night, right up until he died. But it was really that world that they inhabited, and I would go into that world and leave that world again. I would go into it, and I visited them all the way through their lives. I would always go back to Scotland a couple of times a year, even when I wasn't living there. So it was actually, the revelation came when I interviewed my grandfather for The Devil That Danced on the Water, because I wanted to have both the Scottish side and the Sierra Leonean side, or at least enough of the Scottish side. And then he suddenly started to talk about his travels and the fact that he'd been all over the world. And that was really news to me, actually. And then I found out about my grandmother's, aborted migration. And I sort of began to see how the two halves of them fit together, that actually he was somebody who had traveled a great deal in his life, and that perhaps my mother was the way she is for that reason, because her father was like that, and that maybe he had made a decision to settle and stay in Aberdeen in this one house for the rest of his life because of the way that my grandmother was. So personality has a lot to do with it, and character has a lot to do with it. But certainly in the last 10 years, and a lot to do with, my mother's retired now, so she's doing what a lot of elder people are doing, which is, she's interested in genealogy. So she's finding stories, and I'm finding stories, and we're putting our stories together, and we're going off in search of our stories. And that's very much what the essay Hain was about. We had her parts of the stories and my parts of the stories that I'd heard. And so we went off to the Shetlands and the Orkneys, and my younger brother who lives in Hong Kong. So we all flew in from different places. My mother now, is it like a snowbird or a sunbird? Which one do you call it? But she follows the sun. So she lives in New Zealand. What is it?
We call them sunbirds if they go to Florida.
Sunbird.
Yeah.
So she lives in the one hemisphere, according to where the sun is. And some people might say there's not much sun in Scotland, but anyway, when there is some sun, she's in Scotland. So we all flew in, and my younger brother lives in Hong Kong, and so we all flew in together and met, and we went off to the Shetland Islands. It's this wonderful coming together. Actually, I could read a bit. Should I do that?
Yeah, I would love you to, please.
Because it touches on the things we've been talking about. And so we went off to the Shetlands. I'd actually been there before. So did my mother. But we were in search of the croft that belonged to my great-great-grandmother and my mother's great-grandmother. And then we were on the ferry, and actually we said to somebody when we were going over that's what we were there to do. And he said, "Oh, which croft?" Which was not the question we were expecting at all. But everybody in the Shetlands, we realised, knows exactly which geographic location. So here we are. Field is marked on maps of Unst and signposted on the road, and it took us no time at all to find. Field, it turned out, comprised 3 properties, 2 ruined croft houses and one that looked like a new build, which my mother figured to have been raised on the site of a 3rd croft. In one of these had lived Ursula Cecilia Heinrichsen, my great-great-grandmother. I untied the knot on the gate, and we crossed the field towards the nearest ruin. Ahead of us, a wimbrel shot from the undergrowth. The building's stonework had withstood time well. The main structures and supporting walls were in place, including the door and window lintels. Among the stones, I found old bottles, the glass heavy and clouded, and a Vaseline petroleum jelly jar from the 1930s. By the gate of the 2nd croft house lay a dead lamb, its eyes pecked out. Birds nested in the alcoves of the ruins. Crofters survived on whatever they could grow or forage from the land and take from the sea. They raised animals and grew what vegetables they could. The men fished, the young women worked as gutter girls, hands deep in herring innards of the fishery. The old women knitted fine woolen shawls. The 1886 Crofting Act offered some tenancy protections, but in Ursula's time, the crofters were entirely beholden to the landlords to whom they paid dues, in their case, the Earl of Zetland. In time, Ursula Heinrichsen left the island and somewhere along the way dropped Ursula in favour of Cecilia and changed Heinrichsen to Henderson. And as Cecilia Henderson, she took a job serving table in a large house in Edinburgh. I question if it was ever a viable livelihood, said Robert Hewson, whom I met and talked to at the hotel bar where I waited for my mother to come down from her room. Robert had crofted, worked as a lighthouse attendant, sold insurance, tried and failed to grow trees. Spruce from Norway and lodgepole pine, he told me. The seeds for the latter he sourced and sent from Vancouver Island and had sent from Vancouver Island, but even then they could not withstand the salt blast. For those who stay, life shares one thing with the crofters. They do what it takes to survive. In The Prairie in Her Eyes, Anne Dorn writes of her hometown of Murdo in South Dakota. Don't ask me how people know. I knew. I could run a finger down the pictures in the high school yearbook, picking out who would stay and who would go. Like Unst, Murdo is a place where the wind blows hard all year long. Robert's grandfather, John, or Old Erin, had been a six-marine skipper in the late 1800s. Robert's son had joined the outflow of islanders and lived now in New Zealand. Robert's daughter, on the other hand, was a stayer like her father and taught junior high to the island's 50 children, who, in order to attend sixth form, must leave for Lerwick or Bray, 40 and 60 miles away on the main island. Depopulation has been a concern in the Shetlands for more than half a century. In 1960, Shetlanders came up with the idea of a heimferden, a festival conceived as a way of reconnecting with kinfolk the world over, of letting them know they were always welcome back. Roughly 1,000 descendants of Shetlanders, heimfarers from all over the world, travelled to the islands for the last heimferden in 2010, among them my mother. It's funny you came to write about stayers, but actually everyone leaves, remarked Gregor, that's my younger brother, a day into the trip. That was the thought that had begun our journey, which we talked about on the ferry over when I'd said that although we lived at a time when public and media attention was focused on those who migrated, I was interested in what it was that compelled people to stay in the place they first called home or hame. Ideas of home produce a cultural schism, for home is at once the focus of great nostalgia for some. Equally for others, home is a place they cannot wait to get away from. Home is somewhere you escape from, grow out of, return to. Yet even those who revere the idea of home rarely seem able adequately to describe it. I'm often asked the question, where is home? And a sense that my efforts at a reply are found wanting. The reason for this, I believe, is a conceptual mismatch between me and my interlocutor on the definition of the word home. For them, those people who want an answer from me, I have discovered two things to be consistently true. Home is always located in the past. It is not enough for me to say Arlington. Also, it is a noun used strictly in the singular. The word homes is antithetical to the idea of home. I am someone who can live, within reason, anywhere. So is my mother and so is my brother. Joan Didion, who is 7 years older than my mother, wrote in her 1967 essay on going home, Sometimes I think that those of us who are now in our 30s were born into the last generation to carry the burden of home. I don't suppose my mother read Didion's essay, though she is the embodiment of it, the most itinerant person I have ever known. My mother has lived in 19 countries on 5 continents, first with one husband and then another and then alone. In between, she has visited dozens more, taking in new countries year by year. She has travelled with a husband and small children. She has travelled alone by plane, train and automobile and on foot, often to places considered unsafe. Now, frustrated by the constraints of age, she has accepted the necessity of travelling companions and will board a coach or a cruise ship, though she remains resolute in her need to leave home. When I think of this need in her, I realise I should have been unsurprised by my grandfather's trove of travel pictures. As for me, I have to travel so often for work that I have come to regard staying home as a luxury. Also, I am something of a homebody. It's simply that I am flexible about where exactly that home might be.
Oh, so lovely to hear that passage read. I have so much I want to ask you, but I'm very aware that we have about 10, 15 minutes until it's time to open this up to questions from the audience. As you were talking about your family of crofters and the past in Scotland as being one of subsistence crofter farming, it made me think of this book, Independent People by Halder Laxness, which is the story of a stubborn crofter who decides to try to make it on his own when clearly the land is telling him it's not going to work out very well. And I guess I wanted to ask you, in your travels, you've just described the way that people kind of read you and reveal their attitudes towards home by the questions they ask of you. But so much of this book is you looking out at other cultures, you in Tehran, you on the street in West Africa, you watching someone steal peanut butter from the Whole Foods. I wonder if you can riff a little bit just on what the idea of home breaks down to, depending on where you've been. You've talked about nostalgia just now in this passage, but is there a notion of home as portable as yours that you've come across in your travels?
Let me have a think. I do remember, I do remember the first time I began to really start consolidating thoughts about home. And I by that time, I think I'd done a couple of interviews with people who said, "Where is home?" Oh, there was an interviewer who thought he'd caught me out. I remember this very distinctly because I referred to Sierra Leone as home. And he said, it was an Englishman and we were in London. He said, "You've just called it home." And I said, "Yeah, but I would say the same thing. If I was in Sierra Leone talking about England, London anyway, or, Britain, Scotland, any part of the British Isles, I would also say home, right? And if I was in London now and I said home, I might mean America. But if I was in America, I might mean London. It's like they're all homes. The closest I've ever got to, I think, that kind of feeling of home as a portable notion, was with other people like me, of course, but in the longer term, I spent a bit of time in Timbuktu, which is a place I like very much, and Mali, which is a country I like very much, and I spent a little bit of time every now and again with the Tuareg. I was working, I was making documentaries and things, so, but, what I noticed about the way in which they talked about home was they were simply talking about the desert landscape. That was their home. Okay, so where the Tuareg came into conflict with everybody or the Fulani or any of those wandering tribes of the the Greater Sahara region, is that the Sahara, in the hundreds of years that they've been wandering, it has now been chopped up into boxes, and part of it is Chad, and part of it is Mali, and part of it is Morocco, and part of it is Western Sahara. So but for them, home was the whole expanse. It was sort of basically everything above the Sahel and above. That was home for them. And home was not located in a specificity. It wasn't located in farming. It wasn't located in a structure, right? They moved their tent. It wasn't even located in objects, because they traded those objects wherever they went. So home was simply this vast expanse that now covers, goodness knows how many countries, but, I kind of guess at least 6 countries. It was this vast expanse which had been chopped up, and they were now being told, no, you can't have this home, you can't have this home, you can't have that home, And I think that's a way of looking at what's happened to all of us, increasingly as a sort of idea of nationalism takes root. The idea that we have to find an identity, we have to create an identity, and that identity has to work within the walls of another space. So that the Tuaregs are being asked to say, I am Malian, or I am Chadian, or I am Moroccan. They're being asked to pin themselves down in a way that they're not used to, in a way their minds don't think. So I think that there are those of us. But you can take that right back. One of the things I write about in Haim is the Vikings, and the fact, if you look at Viking history and how far they travelled, we now think they went all the way to Canada, we went all the way to the Black Sea, all the way down the coast. They went miles. And so in a way, I come from both of those cultures. So the Sierra side of me, and I'm not a Tuareg, but I am Malian, and that's what the Sierra oral culture told me after, which was then proven by the DNA test, but also the Scottish side with that constant migration. I speculate, and I'm only half serious, but I speculate on the fact it's no surprise that I don't have an idea of home that is rested on a single piece of soil, because it has never, ever, ever been part of the stories I was told. Never.
This book has 10 or 11 long essays, and then 5 or so short ones that are almost like fables. And the most fabulistic of them is one called In Timbuktu. And I wonder if you could just read that, because it sort of illustrates in the most beautiful way what you just said, and sort of takes it to a deeper level even. It's on page 109.
Oh yeah, we put it just before Haim, right? So those of you who don't know, this is my editor here. So this book was it was part of a double act. Okay, In Timbuktu. You almost didn't have to do that, because this is a very short essay. In Timbuktu, I stopped a man to ask him the way to the post office. The man had a question of his own that he wanted answered first. Is it true, he said, that in Britain people have a thing about Timbuktu? Yes, I said. People think it is far away, like the farthest place on earth. At this, the man laughed for a long time. Then he gave me directions to the post office. You bring John back?
Hello. I'm coming back, yeah.
It wasn't worth you going. But...
I love that. I want to ask you another question, because this book is alternating, like your novels do, between, stories that you have partially witnessed to stories that you're telling of others, and the story Haim is followed by a story about the last veterinarian in Sierra Leone, Dr. Jallo. And I'm curious how differently essays feel to you when you're thinking about something that you have entire ownership over versus interacting with the lives and stories of others, as in how much that alters the flexibility of your thinking.
Well, it alters it in a way that, the first thing is, do I have an essay or do I not? So with Haim, it was all in my own hands, right? It was something like I'd grown up with, my family. I knew, I sort of knew that I knew enough. And the essay is the journey of inquiry, right? Wherever that took us. With Dr. Jalloh and even with Timbuktu, I think of Timbuktu as a found story. So there's a moment where it's just a found story, right? You could pick it up off the ground like a little jewel. And I often think, sometimes when I teach, I show my students a picture of the two Picassos. So there's a bull, which is the bicycle seat. The bicycle seat is the head, and the horns are the handlebars. And then there's various sketches or paintings by Picasso. And one is from his imagination and memory, but the other one is found. He found those objects and he made a story. So I think of essays generally as found objects, but some of them require you to find more pieces. And so with the one about Dr. Jalloh, who's this heroic vet in Sierra Leone, the only one working there for many, many years. He may not be now, but he certainly was then, but who shares the passion that I have for dogs, and in particular, actually, homeless dogs, stray dogs, and street dogs. And he spent his life, his career, trying to protect them. And I'm somebody who has adopted a lot of stray dogs in my life, so we had this in common. So I had already begun to think about, some of these essays take me forever because I'd already begun to think about what is it that visitors to Sierra Leone, the Westerners, don't understand about the way in which we relate to the dogs. So, if anybody who's watching has been to Freetown, you'll see that there are just dogs everywhere. I mean, they're just everywhere. You can't walk to the end of the road without passing 30 dogs lounging around or moseying but Westerners who I met in Sierra Leone would demonstrate distress at the sight of these dogs, and they say, the poor dogs, they're not looked after, they're thin, they're mangy. And it's true, they were thin and they were mangy, but let's not forget, this was at the end of the war, number one. And number two, you're in the poorest country in the world. But what I saw was that the dogs were, number one, alive, and number two, not being rounded up and put into kill shelters. And number three, if you paid any attention at all, you would see that people went out to feed them at night. People got out of their what we call pambody, which is your little structure, your little shelter. If you're a slum dweller, or you have your little pambody, which is usually made of corrugated iron and whatever you can find. And the people in those would go out at dusk and they would put food out for the dogs. So there was demonstrably a relationship going on there, but the Westerners couldn't see it. Right? All they saw was, because they lived in a world of pets, and they lived in a world, where dogs wore little outfits and had special food, and they couldn't see that there was still love there. It just couldn't be demonstrated in the same way. And as I said, in Sierra Leone, we don't have kill shelters. We don't round every dog up. There's no dog snatcher in sight. So, I was already ruminating on that and finding myself in these sort of long explanatory conversations where I was having, which I found myself doing a lot, is trying to explain one culture to somebody from another culture, and try and get past that blind spot, that wall, and very often the superiority, but that wall of, it must be so different, how can they do this? Mm. And ultimately, when I met Dr. Jalloh, which happened when a particular dog of mine had been hurt, when I met Dr. Jalloh, I thought, okay, that I've got it right. This guy, he's my character. So it's like a novel, right? He's my character. I found the way of telling the story, and the way of telling the story is through this extraordinary man. And so then I have my elements, I have my setting, I have my themes, and then now I have my character, and my character can do the narration.
I'm going to ask everyone who's watching to start to get their questions together. I have one final question for Aminatta, and I'm sure you have some as well. There's a ask a question box down here. And the last thing was, Aminatta, you know, we've been talking about Dr. Jallow and his work. Animals are a huge part of this book. They figure in the foreground and the background of many of the essays. And this is a book about migration and the way it changes attitudes and beliefs and people who undergo migration and how they look differently upon arrival, where they go. And it's also, to some degree, a book about making homes wherever one goes, and you go because you're a main character. But obviously, the actors in this book who have, to some degree, the least amount of, at least verbal agency about their home and us being there are animals. And you end the book with a piece about coyotes, wolves, and then deer in your backyard in Arlington. And I guess I wonder if you could think for a little bit about, you know, what it means to live in a world with, to share a world with animals who have very complex knowledge systems that are inaccessible to us. And how does one write the migration story of a species that you cannot speak to?
I mean, not just migratory, but evolutionary, because what coyotes have done is that they have hyper-evolved. So for those of you who don't know as much about coyotes as I now do, but it's a fascinating story, the American coyote, that basically began in the deserts of the West as almost one kind of animal, and in a very short space of time, I mean less than 100 years really, has moved north and then east and then down, such that, you know, I now have a coyote in my neighborhood in Virginia, and discovered that, I mean, if you have one, you have many, of course, but you know, when I was researching, over the years I've been researching the movements of coyote, discovered that actually where I now live is the most recent sighting place of the coyote. But the other thing that's happened is not just that they've done this great migrationary arc, but they have also adapted, physically adapted, to such an extent that wildlife biologists did not think that they were coyotes, right? They thought that they were something else, and they had different names at different times, like timber wolf or a brush wolf and things. And eventually the wildlife biologists have sort of settled. I mean, these things remain in flux, but they've sort of settled on the idea that these actually are coyotes, but they have hyper-evolved. And the reason that they have hyper-evolved is essentially, human agency. So humans did a couple of things. Number one, killed the wolves. I mean, that's the big one, killed the wolves. So wolves would normally kill coyote, or at least prevent them from entering their territory. So basically, by killing off all the wolves, which the American settlers did, yay number of years ago, they opened up all this space to the coyote, and the coyote is actually much, much more adaptive than the wolf is. But the second thing that coyote had to adapt to was its diet, to learn to eat junk food, basically, and raid the bins of humans, but also to stay away from humans, to adapt its behavior to stay away from humans. So it's done all of these things, but they also think that maybe at some point, because the coyotes may have mated with wolves, so that wolf DNA has now survived, actually, the extirpation of the wolves. But so actually they do have some physical wolf characteristics. The size, they're a little bit grayer, their paws don't well, they of course do or don't sweat. I can't remember which way it goes round, but they're just a little bit more wolf-like. But on the other hand, so actually, in a way, what's happened is that the wolf has outwitted the human by managing to live within the coyote, right? So, how do you tell those stories? I mean, you can only observe very, very closely. And I talk to a lot of wildlife biologists. I observe very closely. I talk to all the people in that field. I also know that it's a field that's in flux, that there's a debate going on. There isn't one answer. And that's why I love the essay form so much. So that, when you started this, when we started this conversation, John, you said about inviting people to share the thinking. It's like I'm not just inviting people to share my thinking, I'm inviting you to share the thinking of an entire profession of people who think about this all the time. But then also looking, I do observe the animals to the extent that I can, but then I also observe the human reaction to them, which is of either hostility or acceptance. And very early on, a wildlife biologist brought to my attention the two ways of looking at the way animals live in the city and how it's described. And he said you can either call it human-animal conflict or you can call it human-animal coexistence. And it seems to me that everything about this book is about learning coexistence, right? Everything about this book. Whether it be people, whether it be places, whether it be habitats, it's all about coexistence. And so the final essay in the book is about coexistence. And also coexistence and land, so that the coyote has moved into human areas out of its own habitat and moved into human areas. But at the same time, humans have moved into the areas previously occupied by animals. And the other animal that appears in that final essay is the deer. And coming to American suburbia was quite fascinating for me to see deer walking up my road. Sometimes I open the front door and there's like a herd of deer standing outside. Or they come and look at us having breakfast in the morning. And we're just sitting there having breakfast. The deer are just all standing 10 yards from us. And of course, hunters can't believe this, but deer adapt to the absence of hunters the way they adapt to the presence of hunters. And many of my neighbors get extremely upset about the presence of the deer. And, I get a little vexed with all of it, but I get particularly vexed with that because there is no doubt that the place upon which our houses were very recently built was a forest, and that forest was inhabited by deer. And you really can't complain if the deer have not moved on. You really can't complain.
Yeah, you've sent me a picture or two, and I always feel like they're kind of coming back to their forest saying, what are you doing here?
Yeah. And because part of it actually is, just about 100 yards from my house, it is actually the last remaining bit of woodland in this area, which is where the deer are supposed to live. But the deer won't be controlled, and it annoys that element of control freakery in humans that you can't put up a sign for the deer and tell them to stay in their enclosure. Forget it. You can't put up a sign for anybody, can you?
There's a question in the audience saying, did you know that Ceylon's first president was once a dog catcher?
That'll have to be explained to me. I know who Sierra Leone's first president was, which is Milton Magai. I didn't know we even had dog catchers there, or that he was a dog catcher.
Yeah,
that would be going right back to the very to the early 60s, 1961. I didn't know. I would need to have that explained to me. The answer is no, I didn't. I didn't even know we had dog catchers. But I can only tell you this: he didn't do a very good job. Yeah. But he was a revered president, let me not. But if he was a dog catcher, he didn't have too much luck.
If you're listening, and what Aminatta has been talking about the last couple of minutes has intrigued you, you really must check out Happiness, her most recent novel, which is set in London, and a man has come to town for a conference in trauma, and his niece is missing, has gone missing, and he gets together a kind of ragtag group of people who are new to London, and they go looking for her, and it begins a sort of meditation on belonging and space, because in the background of all this, there's also an American field biologist who's studying fox behavior in London, and foxes are kind of the agents of the plot. They draw the two main characters together in the first prologue, and they come up again and again. And it's the first novel I've ever read where the kind of built environment of the city is situated on an environment that is also simultaneously inhabited by animals who are of equal value. So Stephen's not, this will have to be explained to me. So Io just wrote.
No, I can explain it. Shaker Stevens, yes, he was the first president, of course, because he was a dictator who made himself president. Well, I'm not surprised he was a dog catcher. He was many other things, which I'm going to be too polite to mention right now. Yes.
Anyway, so if you're in the market for happiness, I highly recommend Happiness itself. And I guess I want to ask you one final question about the sort of the value of writing spaces with complexity that involve participants who can't be asked about their role in them, namely animals. And I wonder if you've read other books that are in this vein, Aminatta, that do this well, because you, as she was speaking about, the fact that she's inviting you not just into her thinking, but the thinking of other specialists, it made me want to comment that, as an essayist, Aminatta is probably second to very few in standing upon the work of others, as in Barry Lopez, as an essayist, was very good at always highlighting whose work he was referring to, and making something which seemed singular and driven by one voice, i.e. his own writing and essays, a collaborative process. And I'm curious, Aminatta, in your reading of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, if there are other writers who are out there across the globe who are kind of creating three-dimensional space as inhabited by animals and humans in their work.
Well, the first writer that I ever came across, who I think had an impact, two actually, who I think had an impact on me, that one, a very astute, one I quote a lot, and the other one, a very astute reader, pointed out to me recently. He was reading my memoir. But when I was a child and very much already a lover of animals, I read two works, White Fang by Jack London, which I read in Sierra Leone, borrowed from the British Council Library, read in Sierra Leone. And I think actually Jack London, who I suppose must have been one of the first people to do it, but he does it very well, because he sort of slides in and out of a sort of murky consciousness for the dog, for the wolf dog. He doesn't give the wolf dog actual thoughts, but he gives him he gives responses to the world that he sees around him. And he gives him a gaze, right? He gives him a gaze so you can see that world through the animal's eyes. And the other person who, when I was a kid, I read so closely was My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell, which I just, I loved. And I was a child then, but that again, a reader very recently wrote to me and said, a lot of this memoir reminds me of My Family and Other Animals. And I thought, oh my God, of course, that is what I grew up reading. And it's the child's eye view, of this microcosmic world of ants and lizards and tiny things and the child may be have the most sort of power in that world, except of course when young Gerald Darrell encounters a scorpion, but actually that world is, it shapes the world, it shapes his understanding of the wider world. So those two were significant influences. I mean, more recently, I really have to think about, there's, I mentioned it to you very recently, actually, the Anax, the dog, in Iris Murdoch's book, but I forget which book it was. Was it The Green Knight, or was it? We were talking about this, weren't we?
It was The Green Knight, because the dog plays a significant role in that family when the family sort of kind of breaks up. Very late in the book, the dog becomes a character in its own right, and you enter the dog's head.
And she does the same thing. She enters the dog's consciousness.
Yes.
But again, she doesn't give it formed thoughts.
Yeah, the dog isn't speaking in sentences.
Yeah, exactly. So the bit that I remember most closely is that the dog gets lost. He gets lost in London, and he passes somebody he's met. And it's just a smell. He catches a smell that he recognizes. And he realizes he knows that person, and he turns round. But it's never fully expressed. Exactly. It's not a sentence. It's just like a moment. He catches that. And then because the dog turns around, the man also turns around, and the man looks and says, Anax. But I have to say, I mean, I do have a couple of other books of works written where people have entered the human mind, but the animal mind. But I can't think of too many examples which have done it better than those.
There's a question about reading more globally, and I'm curious if I could spin this a little bit, because we've been, talking about place and home and your family and where they come from, and migration and how it's perceived depending on who's traveling and why people migrate, and how you write a story about migration versus someone else's migration. And I'm curious if I could ask a two-part question to kind of end with, which is, and I mean this in the most metaphorical way, is do you ever get lost? As I know you have slightly dodgy direction.
I got absolutely no sense of direction. Of course, I get lost all the time.
But like in a kind of broader sense, I think you're. You
mean sort of?
Yeah, your kind of metaphysical sense.
Yeah.
I think your micro sense of direction is terrible. But I think your macro sense of direction is fantastic and almost infallible. And I guess I wonder if it's failed you at all recently in the last 15 years, and if you can and if you understand why it failed you, if it did.
I don't know. I mean, John is joking, but he's right. I have no sense of direction, but I think it's because I'm dreaming so much. You did point out that I'm an observer, and I think I spend so much time thinking, look at that, look at that, what's that person saying? But I'm almost never really concentrating on where I'm going. So you and I were we were Portland or somewhere, and you were relying on me for directions, and I was like, you are making a terrible mistake. But I mean, I'm happy to try to help you, but this is a terrible mistake. But have I been lost metaphysically in the last 15 years? Unless it's something you're thinking of that I'm not thinking of, I would say no. But since I moved to America, so when I go to a place, I think I have to figure out these people and work out how they think. So that's generally what I do when I go to a place. I have to, let me try and figure out how this place operates. How do these people think? How does this place operate? What are the pieces? And I guess it took me a little longer with them. Well, I don't know if it did actually or it didn't, but because America has two different narratives, right? America has a narrative of itself, and it's very, very, very good at projecting that into the world. It has major industries behind it, right? Like Hollywood and the publishing industry and, I don't know, newspapers, I mean, the media, the social media and everything else, the internet. So America has its own narrative, and then there's what you see when you get here. And there's, the two things don't meet. So the disconnect I have had when I've been here is talking to the very many Americans who believe and accept the narrative, the narrative that they've been told, the narrative that they've seen repeated over and over and over again, and all those people who don't. But also the outside gaze, which I possess, which doesn't see, I don't see what they see, right? I don't, it doesn't look like that to me in any way, shape or form, but usefully I have other, because, this is the great thing about traveling, I have other reference points, and those reference points have helped me to understand America a great deal more. But I remember one of the really funny conversations I had when I first turned up was an American saying to me, he said something about, well, you colonials. And I said, I'm the colonial? And he said, yeah. And I said, no. I come from two colonized countries. You're the colonial. You're the colonial. Right? So that was like, hang on a minute. You're a white American who came to America. You're the colonial. And I thought it was I thought it was kind of rather sort of revealing and also entertaining, but also about how people can have different narratives about themselves. So to me, America is it's a colonial settler culture, right? That's what it is. It's a settler nation. But to very many Americans of European heritage, they see it very differently. They see it very differently. I won't presume to try to express that for them, but I'm aware that they see it very differently.
The very last question, and then we'll probably is, about reading globally. How does your perspective as a kind of perpetual outsider alter the way you read your way around the globe? So when you pick up a book by Juan Gabriel Vasquez in Colombia, or a book about Egypt by Yasmin al-Rashidi, or whomever it is that you're reading, or a book set in Croatia, are you reading as an observer in that same way that you travel through the world, or is it a different kind of, or do you simply sink into it hoping for a successful dream in the way that, enchanting readers always do?
Well, I don't read it as an observer. I don't read them as works of anthropology because, I've been around the world enough to know that you find the same kinds of people in most places and that their patterns form. And also because when I grew up in Sierra Leone under Shaka Stevens, who's been mentioned once already, under his regime, and many people were being persecuted and killed, and the democracy was being subverted, the place where I found the answers that I was seeking were actually with the South American writers, right? Because they were writing and publishing about what was going on in Chile and what was going on in Argentina and what was going on in those places. And it mirrored in enough ways what was going on in so many African countries that I could see, I could see the pattern, and therefore I could see myself in those characters. So actually, and I know that we have yet to really find an answer to the question, how do we read more globally? But that's what I think. I don't think in terms of countries. I think in terms of themes and content. And the thing that attracts me to a book is not where it's set. It's what it's talking about. Right? What is it talking about? And that's usually what makes me choose to pick up a book. And I didn't grow up with any sense that, I mean, the thing is, I didn't formally study English literature. So I didn't grow up with or develop the idea that English literature meant England, Right. I thought it was just like written in English, which, you know, and so I spent my whole time just reading around things, reading around it. Recently, actually, I was asked to do something. I was asked to do a podcast, which I'm going to record on Thursday, and I had to find a passage. And I guess this is the answer to the question. You know, look at literature and translation. Because I was asked to find a passage, and the host of the podcast said, you know, well, that's in translation, and oh, well, that's in translation, and almost everything I was coming up with was a work in translation. Be it one was Spanish and one was French. Those languages I speak somewhat, but not well enough to. I mean, I could probably work my way through the original, but I wouldn't choose to. So, in answer to the question we were asked, you know, look for works in translation. That's how to read more globally. Think of themes rather than places. That's how to read more globally. And then there are certain prizes like the Booker Prize, the Booker International, which, you know, specifically goes out to look for those works in translation, the best works in translation every year. You know, the shortlist there is a very good place to start. But yeah, I think I just do. I don't think geographically. I think thematically.
Well, one of the beauties of this book is that you can see how over a lifetime Aminatta has managed to travel quite a bit of the world without thinking about nations, and yet deeply engages with everywhere that she goes, and some very interesting people that she meets there. And it's a marvelous book of travel in some ways, because it redefines travel as movement as per whim, as per need, as per desire, and blending those has created a book that I think reveals the fullness of our existence in the world as a migratory species. So for that, I'm very grateful. And for all of you, I'm extremely grateful for coming tonight and sharing this hour with Aminatta Forna. And thank you, Books and Books, for hosting us.
What a great conversation. And John, you're the perfect person to moderate it. Oh my gosh. You know, when I think about reading globally, or just, I always think of you, John. So thank you for the work you've done in introducing us to so many different voices that are just hard to come by. Aminatta, thank you for your work. It's been such a pleasure to hear you both interact, to hear your, you know, thoughts on all of these things. I jotted down a few books because I also love animals. And one that came to mind is just the story of Edgar Sawtelle. I don't know if you ever read it, but it's a Shakespearean thing, but one of the characters raises German shepherds. And I remember how well the thoughts of those German shepherds were expressed in that book for whatever reason. And I also wrote down Watership Down and
Watership Down.
Right?
Yeah.
And Fox 8 by George Saunders, and H is for Hawk. And then I was thinking about the documentary based in Turkey about cats wandering, how cats wander all over and people feed
There's
them.
one about strays now set in
There's
Turkey.
one about strays, about dogs. Yeah, I would love to see that. So
Watership Down, of course, when I was a kid, that was the big book.
And I was a big Jack London person too. I loved it. But anyway.
But yeah, in answer to that, can I echo that about John? In answer to the question, how can we read more globally? Look for anything that's edited by John Freeman. In particular, Freeman's.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
But his journal, anthology, Freeman's, and any of the tales of two cities, tales of two countries, tales of two worlds, tales of two Americas and tales of two worlds. And you'll find in there, particularly in the last one, a host of voices from all around.
Including Aminatta Forna.
Including Aminatta Forna. So thank you everyone watching from everywhere. Remember, you just hit the green button, You can order a copy of The Window Seat. We'll ship it off to you wherever you are in the globe. This includes international. I just hope that we will see you maybe at Miami Book Fair in November.
If you know that we will come.
Okay, then I'll start now.
All right, take
We'll
care.
start now. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Bye.